On the Concepts of Pure Reason. That is the title of the first book of the Transcendental Dialectic. As I said before, this first book is very, very short, and it is followed by a book 2, The Dialectical Inferences of Pure Reason, which is very, very long. Roughly, the idea of the first book is that Kant explains what he means by the concepts of pure reason. What is he talking about? What kind of things are those? How many are there? How are we going to find them? It is sort of an introduction to the topic. And then, once we have the introduction, we are going to delve into these concepts. It turns out that there are sort of three fundamental concepts of pure reason. And we are going to show all the things that go wrong with them, all the illusions that they engender in our use of reason. And that is what the dialectical inferences are going to be about. That is what book 2 is going to be about. And so in book 2, we get all these very, very long and intricate stories that Kant is going to tell us about the soul and immortality, about the world and freedom, about God. That's book 2. Here, there's just a little introduction. So, what is a concept of reason? Very quickly, Kant is going to introduce a new term in his philosophy, and that is the term idea. And it turns out that these concepts of pure reason are what Kant calls ideas. And so the first section here is on the ideas in general. Now, when Kant talks about ideas, and he is very explicit about this, he does not mean it in this extremely general sense that it has in some of the early modern philosophers like Descartes or Locke, where an idea sometimes just is sort of anything that comes up in the mind, right? A sensation would be an idea, and a thought would be an idea, and a concept would be an idea, and a mental picture in the imagination would be an idea. And Kant doesn't want to mean that at all, right? In fact, he says, I am going to take my inspiration from Plato. And so we have here at the beginning of B370, Kant telling us that Plato made use of the expression idea in such a way that we can readily see that he understood by it something that not only could never be borrowed from the senses, but that even goes far beyond the concepts of the understanding, since nothing encountered in experience could ever be congruent to it. So the ideas for Kant are going to be, they're not going to be, sensations, but it's also not going to be something that we could ever find in the table of categories. Because the whole point of the table of categories was that these were the basic concepts that we need to describe and, in a sense, even generate experience. But the ideas, essentially and intrinsically, go beyond experience for Kant. They go beyond experience, and that means that they don't belong to the understanding, at least not the understanding in a suitably narrow sense. They belong really to reason, and to reason insofar as it always points beyond the understanding. And so that's what we want to get a little bit of a grasp on here in this first book. One of the nice things that Kant does in this first section on the ideas in general is he points out that for certain ideas, you cannot criticize them in the same way that you might criticize concepts that are supposed to be concepts of the understanding. Right? We have seen again and again that Kant criticizes concepts, supposed concepts, on the grounds that they cannot be found in experience, right? That they couldn't apply to any experience. And so what Kant does here is he says, look, take something like virtue. Right? Maybe the term virtue never actually applies to experience. Right? Certainly we don't have any proof that the term virtue ever applies to experience. Maybe we even have a proof that it can never apply to experience. That doesn't matter, right? It's still important. It is still sort of the guiding concept of all our actions. So, if that's true about virtue, might be true about other things as well. And I mean, Kant talks about freedom and so on and so forth. Finally, what is interesting, I would say, in this first section is that at the very end, Kant gives us this nice little summary of some of his most basic terms for describing the contents of the mind, right? Perception and sensation and intuition, and finally idea, right? A concept made up of notions which go beyond the possibility of experience is an idea or a concept of reason. Actually, it might have been fun if Kant had put this little passage like much earlier in the book, but okay, I think we gathered most of this from what he said earlier, and it's a nice little overview. Second section, and this is the most important section, I would say, of the three sections of this chapter. It is on the transcendental ideas. And here Kant is going to explain to us what the transcendental ideas are, how we should think about them, and so on and so forth. Okay, a crucial term for Kant here is the idea of a condition and of the unconditioned. And I said a little bit about that already in the previous video, but let me say about that, let me say something more about it. So here we can read on B379 the following. The transcendental concept of reason is none other than that of the totality of conditions to a given conditioned thing. Now, since the unconditioned alone makes possible the totality of conditions, and conversely the totality of conditions is always itself unconditioned, a pure concept of reason in general can be explained through the concept of the unconditioned, insofar as it contains a ground of synthesis for what is conditioned. Okay, what is going on there? A pure concept of reason in general can be explained through the concept of the unconditioned, insofar as it contains a ground of synthesis for what is conditioned. Well, really what Kant is thinking about is the following. Suppose I have something in thought, or, when we think about the objective use of the understanding, maybe in experience. And I have to think it as conditioned, right? I have to think it as dependent on something else. So maybe there's some event happening in the world right now. Well, I have to think that event as conditioned by earlier events, by its causes. Nice. But this sort of generates a puzzle. It doesn't generate a puzzle for the understanding. I mean, the understanding is happy with, applying the law of causation and saying, oh, an event, there must be a cause. Ta-da, ooh, a cause. Ah, the cause is an event, well, there must be a cause. Ta-da, and so we do that too. The understanding is sort of, maybe in a sense, this workman-like procedure for, having a condition and looking for what it conditions, or having something that is conditioned and looking for its condition, just bringing it a step further and further and further every time. Reason, on the other hand, for Kant, involves the ability to make a leap beyond that. Right? To look at the event and the fact that it's conditioned, and the fact that that condition is conditioned, and the fact that that condition is conditioned, and then wondering, okay, but what is the unconditioned that underlies this? Is there an unconditioned that underlies this? What is the unconditioned that underlies it? Can I grasp it? What can I know about it? Right? It is seeing that there is a problem here, that there is a question mark here. If everything that happens because of its cause, well, then it seems that I can explain why anything happens by pointing at its cause, but actually, that presupposes that the cause happens, which in turn has a condition. And so I don't really arrive at a final explanation of anything in this way, but always only a provisional explanation that puts forward a condition, which has to be fulfilled before the explanation can even get started. And so reason tries to push the explanation to the point where we really have an explanation that is no longer conditioned. And so the concepts of reason, the ideas, are going to be the ideas of something unconditioned that would explain the entire sequence of conditions. Or, let us read this little phrase again that I just read to you twice. A pure concept of reason in general can be explained through the concept of the unconditioned insofar as it contains a ground of synthesis for what is conditioned. What we are looking for in reason is the unconditioned, but not like some fruitless unconditioned, right? Not like the idea of something that just doesn't have a condition. No, it's got to be the unconditioned insofar as it contains a ground of synthesis for what is conditioned, insofar as it allows us to pick, to bring together this whole, possibly infinite sequence of conditions and think it as a whole. Right? That is what the ideas of reason have to do. They have to posit the unconditioned that allows us the unconditioned that allows us to think the entire sequence of conditions as a whole, as a unity. That is what the ideas of reasons have to do. Okay, Kant goes on to say, well, there are three types of syllogism. We saw this in the third set of categories, and so reason is all about syllogism. It's all about drawing conclusions. So there must be three ideas of reason corresponding to these three syllogisms. By the way, he says a little bit later, this will only become really clear, right? How those syllogisms relate to the ideas of reason will only become clear later on in the second book when we actually set out to work with them. He does say a little bit more about it though. So there are, Kant says, therefore just as many species of syllogism, and in each of them pro-syllogisms, that is sequences of syllogisms, proceed to the unconditioned. One to a subject that is no longer a predicate. So if I say that, ooh, this is a bright red, I'm applying bright to red. Okay, red, but what am I applying red to? I'm applying red maybe to, I don't know, let's say it's a bright red sensation. Okay, is that sensation sort of, well, maybe that sensation is sort of a modification of a subject beyond that, namely me. Hey, maybe it's a modification of me. Am I a modification of something else, or am I sort of a subject that is no longer a predicate? Maybe I am. Right here we can see how the idea of the soul is going to come in. Another to a presupposition that presupposes nothing further. This is where ideas about, among others, causation are going to come in. And a third to an aggregate of members of a division such that nothing further is required for it to complete the division of a concept. How this relates to God, because it is going to relate to God, is not very clear at this point. So that is something that Kant is going to talk about more when he comes to the section about God. Hence, the pure rational concepts of the totality in a synthesis of conditions are necessary at least as problems of extending the unity of the understanding, if possible, to the unconditioned. And they are grounded in the nature of human reason, even if these transcendental concepts lack a suitable use in concreto and have no other utility than to point the understanding in the right direction, so that it may be thoroughly consistent with itself when it extends itself to its uttermost extremes. So Kant emphasizes again and again that these ideas of reason, in a sense, they have a positive use, right? They allow us to understand what the understanding is after. And they allow us to maybe understand the boundaries of the understanding. But they also have a sort of problematic use, right? I should say a dialectical use, where we are ensnared in illusions and think we can know things that we actually cannot know. Okay. So maybe it's also nice to look at what happens at B384. Where Kant says, when we call something an idea, we are saying a great deal about its object, but just for this reason, very little about the subject. Since as the concept of a maximum, it is something that transcends every possible experience, right? I mean, the entire chain of conditions, we have to think sort of everything, the entire whole, which can never be given to us in experience, because anything given to us in experience is going to point towards these further conditions. So nothing congruent to it can ever be given in concreto, right? Nothing will ever correspond to this in experience. Now, because in the merely speculative use of reason, the latter is really the whole aim, that is, experience is the whole aim of the merely speculative, that is, theoretical use of reason, and approaching a concept that will, however, never be reached in execution is the same as simply lacking that concept. It is said of a concept of this sort that it is only an idea. Thus we might say that the absolute whole of appearances is only an idea, since because we can never project it in an image, it remains a problem without any solution. And so within the context of the critique of pure reason, the ideas are problems that reason sets for itself that allow us to understand the understanding better. But if we try to reach them, that's when things go wrong, because we can't have theoretical cognition of them, because no object corresponding to them can ever be given. And Kant goes on to say, and this is very important, but not so important for the critique of pure reason, but very important for his other works, his later works, especially his moral works, like the critique of practical reason. He goes on to say that for practical reason, this stricture doesn't hold. Right? Practical reason doesn't need an object to be given to it. Practical reason produces something, like an act. I do something with this idea may be in mind, right? This is what we saw in the Plato passage earlier. And so the ideas are going to have a positive use in Kant's philosophy, but only in the a real positive use, only in the practical philosophy, where Kant is going to say, well, theoretically we can't know anything about God, freedom, and so on and so forth. But as a matter of practical reason, we sort of have to believe that we are free. And we have to believe in God, and we have to believe in immortality. There's no argument for it in the sense of something that proves that these things really exist. Something that could be found in the Critique of Pure Reason. Absolutely not. But as a practical necessity, we have to posit them. Okay, that's neither here nor there. Well, it's there, it's not here. But it's good to know why Kant is and that Kant is already here, sort of pointing the way towards his practical philosophy. And so also that his practical philosophy and his theoretical philosophy are very closely related. I'm not saying that everything from Kant's practical philosophy follows from the Critique of Pure Reason, certainly not. But there are very, very important points of contact. So one final important thing that Kant does here is he points out that when we think about these conditions, there seem to be infinite chains going into two directions. Right? For instance, when I think about cause and effect, there seems to be an unending chain of causes and an unending chain of effects coming from every event. And Kant insists on the fact that it is only one of these chains that is relevant to reason. It is only the conditions, not the conditioned. Right? It is only the fact that I have events here and I wonder, yeah, but if there's always a further cause needed, how can anything ever happen? Right? That's the question that reason posits itself. It doesn't posit itself, there is no question really about, wow, if there's always a further effect, how can anything ever happen? There's no question, there's no mystery, right? There's no, that there is always something else that this thing can unfold into doesn't seem problematic. That we have a chain of conditions that never stops, that seems problematic, and that brings forward the idea of the unconditioned. So Kant insists on the fact that, but Kant insists on the claim that reason is after the unconditioned, not after, let's say, the completed, if that's what we want to call it. So finally, in the third section, Kant tells us again something about what we ought to find, what we ought to think. Are going to be the three ideas of pure reason. He relates them to the subject, the object, and things in general. And he tells us that, what we're going to find is an idea about the thinking subject, the unity of the thinking subject, in fact, the absolute unity of the thinking subject, the absolute unity of the series of conditions of appearance, and the absolute unity of the condition of all objects of thought in general. And he relates them to the three, at least in the German philosophy of his time, sort of traditional branches of metaphysics: rational psychology, about the soul; rational cosmology, about the world; and rational theology, about God. And I'm appending the word rational here to point out that we're not talking about empirical psychology or empirical cosmology or revealed theology, right? This is all a priori metaphysical stuff that we are thinking about. Okay, so far for book 1. Book 2 is going to take us many more videos. So we'll see about that next time.